A new book set in the universe of the Hunger Games has just been released, and in many other cases I would say that probably it's time to stop milking the franchise. But Suzanne Collins has a rare talent. She has a talent not just for creating gripping, exciting stories, but for weaving meaningful, thought-provoking commentary through them. And while The Sunrise on the Reaping is incredible and deserves its own discussion, I want to take a step back and discuss the original trilogy. I want to talk about what made it resonate, why it's so relevant, how I viewed it back then, and how my perception has changed over time. It's 2012, I'm 14, and I've just dived headfirst into the world of dystopian fiction. I have devoured the big three: Fahrenheit 451, 1984, and Brave New World. Around the same time, the so-called teenage dystopias were on the rise. Among them was The Hunger Games. I secretly enjoyed it, even though the influencers I followed dismissed it as childish, cheap, and not even a real dystopia. And I convinced myself that even though I enjoyed it couldn't measure up to the classic dystopias I had just read. It's fine to remember now, because looking back, I believe that The Hunger Games is a far more effective dystopia than the very books that define the genre. It might sound like a controversial opinion, but bear with me, I will explain why. I think that one of the main things that makes The Hunger Games so relevant, and not only relevant but powerful and meaningful, is how closely it resonates with the real world. Unlike the classic dystopias that often feel exaggerated and detached from reality, The Hunger Games presents a society that, while extreme, is not that far from our own. Take the capital's use of propaganda and media manipulation. It's impossible not to see parallels with how modern governments and big corporations control narratives, shape public opinion, and distract people from the real issues. The spectacle of The Hunger Games itself, violence repackaged as entertainment, mirrors how we view real-life conflicts and tragedy through social media and reality shows. These days, even worse, are portrayed as something cinematic rather than devastatingly real. The wealth gap between the capital and the districts is another painfully familiar thing. It reflects the stark economic disparities where the privileged few live in excess while whole communities are struggling to survive. District 12, with their poverty and lack of resources, is a reflection of how many of the marginalized groups are treated, ignored until they become useful. Then there is the theme of rebellion and revolution. The way District 13 manipulates Katniss as a symbol isn't just about fighting for freedom, it's about how even well-intentioned movements can be co-opted, how power structures shift but don't necessarily change, and how the people caught in the middle, like Katniss, are often the ones who suffer the most. It's a cynical but a very realistic portrayal of how revolutions play out in history. This is why The Hunger Games feels more relevant than the classic dystopias like 1984 or Brave New World. Those books, while brilliant, paint dystopias as distant and theoretical nightmares. 1984 imagines a world of absolute government control where people are constantly watched and their ideology is crushed. Brave New World envisions society numbed into compliance through pleasure and consumerism. But in reality, the world isn't run by one single oppressive regime or a mindless pursuit of pleasure. It's actually run by a mix of power, propaganda, inequality, and illusion of choice. And The Hunger Games captures this complexity. It shows us a world where oppression doesn't always come in the form of the totalitarian state, but through economic control, media influence, and the manipulation of hope. It's not about a single villain, it's about a system that perpetrates suffering while distracting people with spectacle. And that, more than anything, makes it one of the most effective dystopias ever written. For me, these parallels are not theoretical, they're very personal. I saw distant echoes of The Hunger Games in my own home country of Russia, long before I had to leave. The way the capital controls the narrative is hauntingly similar to how the Russian government manipulates the information and censors dissent, how it twists reality to serve its own agenda. State-controlled media crafts a version of the world that keeps the people in fear, mistrustful of each other, and most importantly, dependent on the government's version of truth. The war with Ukraine was not portrayed as an invasion, but as a special military operation, which purpose is to liberate and defend. Any attempt to question these narratives is met with harsh consequences. Just like the capital silences everyone who defies their version of peace. When I fled Russia, I took with me my Mockingjay pin that I got on the premiere day of the final movie in the theaters. It's just a cheap piece of merchandise that got with popcorn something. It might seem silly, but it felt like a piece of defiance, a symbol of the resistance that I could carry. In Panem, the Mockingjay represents the unintended symbol of rebellion, a reminder that even the most carefully controlled narratives can be subverted. For me, it became a reminder that even in the moment when I felt powerless, I could still hold onto my truth. What makes it a bit more special is the fact that I'm a minimalist and I don't own many things that I don't really need. But yes, still I took this mockingjay with me to another country. And while my experience is rooted to a specific, harsh reality, I think that the Hunger Games resonates far beyond countries like Russia. People in the West may not live under direct oppression, but the series still speaks to their world. The obsession with spectacle, the way tragedies are consumed as entertainment, the commodification of trauma, the way activism is commercialized, it all feels like an echo of the games. Reality TV turns pain into ratings. Social media can manipulate public opinion with ease. Economic inequality keeps growing, and the wealthy often seem untouchable. Living life so detached from everyday struggles of usual people makes it feel very dystopian. It's also striking to think that back in 2012, a lot of what the Hunger Games portrayed seemed exaggerated and not real, something meant to shock rather than reflect the reality. But as time goes on, it feels like the line between the real world and dystopia keeps blurring. Scandals like the alleged Diddy parties or disturbing leaks of the Dubai porta parties reveal a world where the ultra-wealthy act as if they're above the law and everyone else. The idea of a ruling class so detached from the society, living in decadence while the rest of us is trying to survive, doesn't feel like a far-off dystopia anymore. Just like in the capital, there are people shielded with their wealth from the consequences of their actions. When the powerful can break the rules without fear, it creates a reality that feels disturbingly lawless, where justice is reserved for those who can't afford to escape it. The Hunger Games is not just a warning about an imagined future, it's a reflection of the world as it is, and it's a call to notice the things that we might otherwise ignore. Classic dystopias usually end with an individual being crushed by the system, totally defeated. Winston betrays Julia and loses himself to Big Brother in 1984. John the Savage can't escape the grip of Brave New World and ends his life. Even in Fahrenheit 451, when there is a glimmer of hope, the world remains largely unchanged, consumed by ignorance. These endings reinforce the idea that the system is way too powerful and the change is impossible. The Hunger Games subverts this pattern. Katniss doesn't emerge unscathed. She's traumatized, she's broken in many ways, but she survives and the capital falls. The revolution is flawed, and the new order isn't perfect, but there's a sense that change, even imperfect change, is possible. This nuanced, bittersweet victory makes the series feel both more realistic and hopeful. In the real world, oppressive systems don't collapse overnight, and revolutions never lead to utopias. Progress is messy and compromise is inevitable, and the revolutionaries carry the weight of their trauma. Yet, despite all that, there's a possibility of a better future. That's why it's so important to see a different kind of ending in the Hunger Games, one that reflects our own flawed world. It's not just a warning of where we could end up, it's a reminder that resistance, even if imperfect, matters. The series doesn't just criticize power, it offers a glimmer of hope that change is possible, even if it's hard and incomplete. In a world that often feels lawless and overwhelming, that hope is essential. The Hunger Games doesn't offer a simple happily ever after, but it doesn't insist on total defeat either. Instead, it suggests that while power structures are difficult to dismantle, they are not unbreakable. It's a perspective that acknowledges the darkness while still clinging to hope. And that, I think, is why it resonates so deeply in a world where even hope sometimes is viewed as a radical act. That's why the Hunger Games feel so powerful. It offers a perspective that's painfully honest, yet cautiously hopeful. It acknowledges that oppressive systems are complex, but it also suggests that resistance, even if flawed, matters. For me, carrying this mockingjay pin is not just a nod to a story I loved as a teenager. It's a reminder that survival, defiance, and hope can coexist, even when it feels like the odds are never in your favor.